The island nation of Cuba has seen unprecedented demonstrations amid the country's worst economic crisis in decades and nearly 60 years into the United States' embargo on the nation. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden says he supports Cuban citizens in the wake of anti-government protests across the island. Joining us to discuss those protests and the state of U.S. Cuba relations are Maria de los Angeles Torres, a professor of Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois Chicago and a native of Cuba. Eric Torres of the Chicago Coalition in Solidarity with Latin America and who is of Cuban descent. And Alberto Cole, a professor at DePaul University's College of Law. He has a background in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. relations with Cuba. And Professor Cole is also a Cuban native. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. Alberto Cole, let's start with you, please. What is your reaction to some of the protests that we have been seeing in Cuba, which are extremely rare?
I think what we're seeing is a combination of things. Number one, the Cuban government is in bad shape because of COVID, because of the deterioration in the economy, some of which has to do with the Trump sanctions, but also a lot of which has to do with its own economic mismanagement and incompetence. And then thirdly, there's a whole new generation in Cuba today, people under the age of 40 who want to change things. They don't like the fact that in Cuba there is only one political party. They don't like the fact that political activity and dissent are restrained. And they have taken advantage of the gradual spread of social media technologies to begin expressing their disagreements with the government's policy. And so you have seen all this come together in this very spontaneous outburst of protests throughout the island. One of the sad things about Cuba today, by the way, is that a large majority of the younger generation, people under 35, want to leave the country. And that includes people who are children of high party officials, senior government officials, and they want to leave Cuba because they don't see hope for themselves in the island.
And
that's
Maria,
a serious problem for a country.
I want to get Maria in here briefly. We've heard a bit of this just now from Alberto, but remind us what has led us up to this point to these protests.
Well, I mean, I think that I agree with Alberto. I think that there are multiple factors going on. I would say it's not just an economic crisis. I would say it's a political crisis as well. And that political crisis, we can date it way back at the beginning of the revolution, the promise of social justice and democracy. The social justice was delivered in some ways, the democracy was not. And so this has been accumulation, I think, of a political crisis throughout the time. But most immediately this spring, the Communist Party held its Congress. And at that Congress, very little was changed. And I think that the last little hope that many of the economists, for instance, that we're in contact with, that we have exchanges, academic exchanges, had asked for some really simple things, like, for instance, professional licenses for architects. And so the Communist Party decided not to do that. On the other hand, they're allowing foreign investors to come in. There is an elite that makes a lot of money. There is a lot of corruption in Cuba, but that, on the other hand, the constitution that was ratified some time ago makes it illegal for Cubans, on the island to invest.
And Eric, I wanted to talk about the pandemic as well, because Eric Torres, how has the coronavirus pandemic impacted the situation in Cuba?
Well, it has had a strong impact, in the sense that they don't have enough syringes to properly inoculate, their people, to vaccinate their people against COVID. They have their own vaccine that they've created. In fact, they have 6 different types that they have created. One of them has already been approved by the world bodies that are in charge of approving those things. Problem is they have a severe shortage of the syringes, and there's still quite a few people that still need to be vaccinated. They've had almost 7,000 new cases of COVID recently in the last few days. The problem is that they are being they're under this blockade, but from the United States, that's keeping them from getting proper materials for making the medicines and the vaccine and the syringes, and food and other important supplies, fuel for creating electricity, for example. It's very vital that you have electricity to be able to administer your services. So
And
people are understandably upset because they haven't been able to get those things.
right, and Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel blames the U.S. embargo for the economic situation and the shortages. Maria, is this a key concern for Cubans right now?
I have not seen any of the protesters in Cuba saying that they want an end to the embargo. I think the embargo, obviously it's there, there's certain impact, but I think that it would be misreading the situation in Cuba to think that that is the problem, and that at least the way that people on the streets are articulating it. They're articulating it as a political problem, as a domestic problem, and the Cuban government does have options. I mean, there are, even with the embargo, there are options. You can go on a listening tour, or you can go on a shooting tour, okay, when you have protesters. There is a lot of concern about violence. The one thing that I really would like to say is that I think it would be wrongheaded to encourage a military intervention on the part of the United States. And there is a plurality of voices in Miami. Some are asking for that, including Marco Rubio, but many, many more are not asking for that. I do think that the Biden administration needs to gently put on a humanitarian hat, and needs to deal with supporting families in the United States who want to help their families. There are charitable organizations that can also be supported.
And so President Biden actually released a statement yesterday expressing support for Cuban citizens. Here's a bit of what he said.
The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights, and we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence and their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Now, Eric, you were part of a press conference today calling on the government to lift the embargo. Are you satisfied with the U.S. response so far?
No, not at all satisfied with it. I think that one thing that we're not speaking to at this point is the other voices, the voices of all the Cubans who do support the revolution, of which there are many. Every time I've gone to Cuba, which is multiple times, there are just as many voices, if not more, in favor of their revolution than that are against it. And I think the media tends to focus on these loud voices that are always trying to support the agenda of the United States government, which is to basically overthrow the Cuban government, not allow them to be a sovereign government and make their own decisions. So I'm completely against it. I think that Biden is basically just putting on the suit that Trump made. Trump installed a lot more restrictions, sanctions against Cuba, and instead of going back to the way that Obama was opening relations and relaxing and trying to respect more of a proper relationship with Cuba. No, Biden is just enacting what Trump put into place. And so, no, that's not going to be helpful at all.
And I'm going to jump in. I'm going to give Alberto Cole the last word here. Briefly, in just a few seconds, what, Alberto, do you think these protests mean for the future of Cuba?
The protests mean that there's a whole new generation in Cuba, most of whom, by the way, want change on the island. And they want peaceful change. They want peaceful change. And they
not the kind of change you're talking about.
And they want a system in which people can disagree peacefully without being arrested for having a placard opposing the government. And they want a system in which, of course, they can preserve a social safety net and also have economic freedom to pursue their own dreams. And that is the root of why such a large percentage of young Cubans want to leave, including, as I said, I know members of the Communist Party, senior government officials, whose children are living in Europe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom.
This is obviously, sorry to interrupt, we're actually out of time, but this is obviously something that's very personal to all of you, something that you're passionate about, something to keep an eye on. But for now, my thanks to the three of you, Eric Torres, Alberto Cole, and Maria de Los Angeles Torres, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.